Zender family had dreamed of having a covered bridge in Frankenmuth someday. When more parking became necessary for Zender's and the Bavarian Inn, and the available property for that needed parking was located on the other side of the river, it was decided that maybe now was the time to build that bridge. The dream was then committed to paper and ink. That was the easy part. Finding the person to build it would not be. Building authentic covered bridges is nearly a lost art. But Tiny Zender remembered reading a story in the Grit newspaper about a covered bridge project in the New York state. The contractor was Graydon Associates of Ashland, New Hampshire. Zenders contacted Milton Graydon, but he was not interested since Ashland is 1,100 miles from Frankenmuth. The Zenders don't give up so easily. They badgered Mr. Graydon until he agreed to come to Frankenmuth for a visit. That clinched it. And the contract was signed in March of 1978. The handwritten contract on Mr. Graydon's letterhead simply stated that Graydon would build a covered wooden bridge and put it across the Cass River. Mr. Graydon's first move was to order 125,000 feet of Douglas fir from Oregon. 100,000 feet was shipped directly to the construction site to be air-dried. The remaining 25,000 feet was shipped to Ashland, New Hampshire, where the Graydons would fashion the roof rafters over the winter of 1978 or 1979. The rafters would be brought to Frankenmuth by the Graydons in their trusty 1955 Ford truck. In keeping with the traditional means of covered bridge construction, the bridge was to be built on the new parking lot across the Cass River and then moved. 125 squares of cedar shingles were needed for the roof. These shingles and the spruce boards used for the floor were from trees grown and milled in Michigan. Construction on the site was begun in April 1979. While Graydon Associates, Mr. Graydon and his son Arnold worked on the bridge itself, concrete and steel workers prepared the abutments on piers that would eventually support our covered bridge. The steel I-beams are there only to support the bridge as it is moved into place and will be removed later. The sides, known as trusses, are made in the town lattice style, named after Ithiel Town from New Haven, Connecticut, who developed the design in 1820. The first step is to lay the bottom chord. It is built from the center to the outside to be sure they get a 14-inch camber. This will allow the bridge to flex rather than break while carrying a heavy load. This chord is made from 3 members. Most bridges have only 2. Mr. Graydon added a third because of the bus traffic our bridge would accommodate. Now the lattice can be laid out. The pieces are laid at an angle to give the bridge strength and height. There are 120 pieces of lattice on each truss. Each joint was cut with a handsaw. The pieces were butted together, then cut again and again until Arnold could be certain of 100% bearing on the load surface. Every joint was clamped and held firmly until it could be drilled and secured with a trunnel or tree nail. There are 1,890 trunnels in our bridge. 27-inch trunnels were used to fasten the chord members as well as the lattice to the chords. 11-inch trunnels were used to hold the lattice pieces where they join. The trunnels are 2 inches in diameter and made of white oak. They were turned on the Graydon's lathe in New Hampshire the previous winter. The trunnels are driven with a 16-pound sledgehammer and are struck so as not to go in more than 1 inch at a time. This is to prevent breakage. The next step is to fasten the top chord to the lattice. This can be tricky as it must be absolutely plumb with the bottom chord. Once the top chord is in place, it is time to raise the truss into the vertical position. First, the whole truss is raised 7 feet with hydraulic jacks and supported with cribbing material. To complete this task, the Graydons used gin poles rather than cranes, as a gin pole is really a homemade crane. It uses a 35-foot utility pole as a boom. They are harnessed with a pulley at the top and middle with a come-along jack at the bottom. The Graydons built 7 U-shaped frames, which they fashioned to the top of the truss. Mr. Graydon calls them handles for the gin poles. 7 gin poles were used to raise the truss. As the come-along jacks were pumped, the truss was walked up the gin poles. When the truss reached an upright position, the gin poles would be at a 45-degree angle. Before securing the truss in a vertical position, Milton and Arnold Graydon make sure it is plumb. This job complete, work begins on the second truss. Once the second truss is built and raised, work begins on the floor joists. There are 62 main floor joists. Each is 6 inches by 16 inches by 32 feet and cut from Douglas fir. 5 feet on both ends of every joist must be shaped to fit through the lattice to form the base for the sidewalks. Mr. Graydon smooths this surface with a large hand tool called a slick. Another unique feature of the Zender's Holzbreche are these 2 distribution cords. They run the entire length of the bridge and were added by Graydon as another safety measure. Now that the floor joists are in place and fastened to one truss, it is time to join the 2 trusses. The second side is placed on oak rollers. Come-along jacks are used to pull the truss into place. The work runs well into the evening. When completed, the floor joists fit exactly into the second truss, the work of a true master craftsman. Now that the trusses are joined and secured by floor joists, work can begin on the roof. Notches were cut into the top cords for the roof rafters. The rafters which Graydon had prefabricated the winter before were raised and set with a gin pole. Once the rafters are in place, the bridge components become a single unit. Each of the 25,000 cedar shingles were individually inspected and marked. They must be placed with the grain facing down so that water will run off with the grain. The roof shingles were laid up to the location of the first dormer. The dormers, like the rafters and trunnels, were also prefabricated by the Graydons. The dormers were raised by the trusty gin pole and set, as the roof shingles were nailed down. To the best of our knowledge, this is the only covered bridge in the world with dormers. The sidewalk floors are made of Douglas fir and were laid next, followed by the sidewalk siding made of Michigan spruce. Before the main floor of the bridge could be placed, secondary joists were laid in between each of the main joists. The main floor is made up of 4-inch oak and spruce boards, the oak going into the heavy traffic area. The flooring is secured with number 8 common nails, 3/8 inches in diameter and 8 inches long. Each nail hole was pre-drilled, and the nails were then driven with a 16-pound sledgehammer. Now that our bridge is nearly complete, it is time to prepare it for the trip across the river. First, it was necessary to build a track and place oak rollers on the track. Shoes were attached to the center pier pads in order to maintain the 14-inch camber. Shoes are not necessary at the ends where the bridge will sit on the abutments. Our bridge was built on the east parking lot and moved to the river's edge using a capstan winch system. There is a 4-degree incline down to the river, making it necessary to raise the front of the bridge out over the crest of the grade. Then, as the front was lowered, the back was raised. The capstan was then moved to the west river bank. The stiles of the bridge pull now become a yoke of oxen. Buck and Bright are 4-year-old red and white Holsteins who are identical twins owned by Alfred Hayhoe of Diamondale, Michigan. The system of block capstan, come-along jacks, and pulleys enable each of the oxen to pull as much as 180 oxen would normally displace. The entire pull into place was accomplished during a 12-day period in January 1980. Now the bridge was in place and ready to be completed. First, the cribbing, shoes, and other materials had to be removed by the use of hydraulic jacks. Our bridge finally rests on the piers and abutments. After many more hours of work by Mr. Graydon, Arnold, and a wealth of volunteers, our bridge was ready for dedication. September 9th, 1980. Dedication Day for Zender's Holzbreche. Mrs. Marion Burnett, President of the National Society for the Preservation of Covered Bridges, traveled from Boston to be the featured speaker. A conventional ribbon-cutting ceremony didn't seem proper for this dedication. It was replaced by a timber sawing. Tiny and Eddie Zender started the cut. Mr. Graydon and Arnold completed the job. It is appropriate that among the first to officially cross the bridge, are the team of oxen who poled it across the river.